Okay, well, a new study found that cancer patients who took the COVID vaccine lived longer than cancer patients who didn't. Here is the study. Sounds like a miracle, right? The media is pretty excited about it. Here's the Washington Post saying that this is a breakthrough. They're saying that the COVID vaccine could boost your own immunity, especially if you're a cancer patient. Well, that's kind of weird. So let's stop to think about what they actually studied. What they're telling us is that people with either lung or skin cancer who took the vaccine within 100 days of starting immunotherapy lived longer than people who were on immunotherapy didn't. That 100-day window is kind of strange. And note, this is not patients on chemotherapy. A cancer patient that's on immunotherapy is, by definition, in a stronger position with a healthier outlook than one that's on chemo. So what they're telling us is that pre-selected healthier cancer patients lived longer. Okay, they specifically included these two groups. The vaccinated lung cancer patients, they said, lived 16 to 17 months longer, but they could not attribute this to the COVID vaccine because it wasn't a randomized trial. They were studying the data in arrears. The skin cancer patients, well, they don't know how much longer they lived. They're just saying that the vaccinated ones are still living, in fact, have not yet died, but lived longer than the baseline. The media is dressing this up as a miraculous vaccine enhances cancer survival story, when really it's sort of self-selecting immune healthy group outperforming the immunocompromised group. It's like saying people who were well enough to get the vaccine lived longer, which we would logically conclude. So joining us to discuss is Dr. Pierre Kory, who has studied the COVID vaccine and COVID therapeutics since day one. So thank you. He's also the author of the book From Volcanoes to Vitality, the untold story of the Isao Shimonishi, the man who cracked Earth's hidden code for life and health. So this is a story about health. What do you make of the spin on this and what we can take from it, this study?
It's shocking. I mean, here's how I looked at that study. So it's a study that's called a retrospective single center observational study. Now, anytime you have a study like that and you have any findings which result for that, in typical science fashion, they do not allow you to make conclusions from such a study. You can say that we found an association, a correlation, but they don't allow you to say that this does that. So they take this very limited retrospective single center study, and how does the media portray that to the society as if the vaccines are this, amazing addition to cancer therapy, that if you're on a specific cancer therapy and you get the vaccine, it's like a 2-for-1. You do even better. Here's the thing, Natalie, though. I actually think that there is some scientific plausibility to what they found, but it's very narrow. You'd have to get this vaccine very close. And then you'd have to ignore all of the adverse effects of vaccines, which they didn't measure. So it may be true, but you cannot present it as such. And when I look at the paper, you said in your intro, let's talk about how the media presents this. When I look to this journal, Nature, which is considered one of the best journals in the world, and I look at the actual paper and what they write, they do slip in that they found an association, but right at the end, they make a very strong statement that this shows that adding vaccines to immune checkpoint inhibitors extends survival of cancer patients. So it's a definitive statement that's unfounded with the data. But what makes me angry about that is they don't allow us to do that with other data, but they're doing it with this data in this situation. I mean, it shows that there's this complete incentive to try to whitewash these vaccines. You got to try to find something positive to say about these vaccines, even on the weakest data, and they have absolutely no hesitation in doing that.
But what we know is that HHS has banned future research in mRNA vaccines, but the existing mRNA research in cancer vaccines, would we call them vaccines, cancer therapies, has been allowed to go forward. So it seems well-timed to me for them to say, see, and this is what the paper specifically addressed, is do our RNA vaccines stimulate innate immunity? So what they're trying to do is sell us this idea that the mRNA technology is beneficial in cancer therapy. What do we know about the validity of that?
Yeah, I mean, there may be a slight role in cancer in that narrow respect, but they're also saying in that paper they're using the immune activation that the vaccines cause, which in non-cancer patients, not on those medicines, is generally very damaging. But they're showing in this very narrow situation of someone on an immune checkpoint that by activating the expression of the tumor, those drugs work better. It's a very weak argument, but again, it's like you said, it's the timing, right? That it's yeah, unfortunately the media is full of propaganda. So are the journals. They're sending messages that are timed around political endpoints, and it's not subtle to me. I think it's subtle to most of society, but I see it and I call it out every time. And now, can I just bring up like a similar paper which tries to do the same thing. It tries to present the vaccines in a positive light. But this paper, which was just a week ago or 10 days ago, did it in the most brazenly fraudulent way. And it screamed fraud. It was so clear that they did something fraudulent. They published a paper in JAMA, right? Well, again, another top medical journals. By the way, I think those are the most corrupt. The highest impact journals are the most controlled by pharma. There's not even a question.
Absolutely. I mean, you just mentioned Nature. Nature is the paper that took directives from Dr. Fauci to obscure the lab leak. We cannot let them off the hook for that. So it's obvious that anything they publish from now on, we're going to have to be skeptical of.
There's no question. The only real good science I find are actually in like what are called second and third tier journals that they don't monitor, that media doesn't cover, that media doesn't disseminate. But you can find really good stuff that you can use as a doctor. The stuff that comes out of the top is so curated and corrupt. It's ridiculous. But last week in JAMA, they published a paper which essentially concludes that vaccination in pregnancy does not increase rates of fetal malformation. Beautiful conclusion of the paper. Yeah. But when you open the paper, you find out how they got to that result, and they did it in the most brazen way. When they did the study, they refused to look at women. They only looked at live births. Live births. That is like something you don't do. That's like research trial design for fetal malformations 101. It's been well known that when you only look at live births, you will miss toxicity signals. In fact, the WHO and the EMA for years have said when you're doing teratogenicity studies, meaning looking at effects on fetuses, you have to include all pregnancies. So this is standard research trial design for anyone who studies fetal toxicity issues. Why would this august group of researchers in the top journal of the world conduct a study where they purposely looked only at live births? And then further, they only looked to malformations detected in the first year. That misses another 20 to 40% of malformations, which are typically diagnosed later. So can I ask again why these august researchers limited it to 1 year? And then they only used billing codes to find those malformations. That misses another 10 to 20%. So you have a study published in JAMA where they literally designed it to miss about, my conservative estimation, 60% of malformations. That reduces the numbers so low, it doesn't reach statistical significance, and voila, you say, oh, it's safe in pregnancy. It is. Right. And you have to understand, they are hiding the data. We know that. Our lived experiences shows that. You know how many people I know just in my world who've lost pregnancies after vaccination? In the first trimester, in the second trimester, anyone who's alive with a brain and eyes can see it. And you have JAMA telling you, oh no, we did this fancy little study and it shows that it's safe. I mean, it is beyond infuriating, Natalie. I mean, we're seeing these brazen lies that are contradicting our lived experiences, and we're seeing it over and over. And I hope people are able to recognize this more and more. It's part of what I do. I try to point this out to let people know they're lying. They're lying in journals, they're lying in newspapers, they're lying on TV.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it does seem like the narrative around cancer is very much changing. JAMA published a story, we covered this maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, saying that cancers are overdiagnosed in young people, which seems to obscure the fact that cancer diagnoses are rising since the pandemic.
Unbelievable. Overdiagnosed in young people. Yeah. Are
So
young people
what they were
undergoing cancer
trying to
screening?
say, what I surmise, is that young people are being alerted to things that would not kill them, cancers that would not continue to progress. They could live with this. They never needed to have known about it, but they get chemo. They, put themselves in a pathology. They're forever a cancer survivor, that they didn't need to have done that. I mean, I don't know which ones are like mild cancers you don't need to know about what they're trying to
I'm
say.
trying to unpack that logic. And this phenomenon that they describe, this sudden overdiagnosis, why did it appear societally in the last few years? Why wasn't that the case 5, 10, 15 years ago? I mean, cancer has been rising in young people for a while. We know that. But the rates and the amount and the cancer expenses in this country has exploded since the advent of the campaign. So they want to pretend that it's all part of a historical trend. But when you really look at the data and you look at these, it's almost like it reminds me, Natalie, of the huge explosions in life insurance claims for young people who were dying in 2021, where they tried to blame it on like obesity, diabetes,
Right.
people getting fatter, and then and suddenly they're dying younger. Yeah, it's suddenly like a huge spike in, drug addiction. That's what it was. It was all
Yeah.
drug overdoses. So I'm saying, wait, drug overdose has been they're rising slowly and they're there for 10 years, but why the sudden spike in 2021? None of their stuff holds up to really even simple logic or critical analysis.
And yet, the chemotherapy patients are still being told to get the COVID vaccine, because even though there are risks associated with it, you would take someone who has such severe immunocompromised status and still give them. What do you make of this? I mean, how do I guess this, I never thought, what do advanced chemotherapy patients, how did they react to the COVID vaccine? We must have seen something.
I don't have data from that specific cohort. Mine's much more sort of general and categorical, but I can
Yeah, I'm
imagine.
just wondering why they're excluded if you're going to make this broad claim about cancer patients, but only
Yeah.
take the cancer light.
You're doing it on, I think everything is done deliberately. I'm sorry. My cynicism knows no bounds. Anything they do in order to how they look at data, how they shape the data, I always cite the article, The Disinformation Playbook, right? It was written by the Union for Concerned Scientists in 2017. And they outline how corporations and governments, how they counter science that's inconvenient to their interest. And there's 5 tactics developed by the tobacco industry in the 1950s, and they're still doing them today. And the number one tactic is something called the fake. And that's where they design studies with predetermined results. So, for instance, that fetal malformation study with the vaccines, those scientists had marching orders: go do a study finding safety in the vaccines in pregnancy. This one, this immune checkpoint one, I don't know that that's the same thing. I think that result may be there, but I think they're overstating its importance. And I think the media is fanning the flames over this really association that really should not require front page news. So, I mean, there's also, I think, coordination between journals and media and what they kind of amplify. But I just have this cynicism, Natalie, that these studies coming out of these major journals have predetermined results, because there's a flip side to that. I also know what doesn't show up in those journals. All of these compelling studies showing the harms and the death rates and the increases in cancer, all of
Mhm.
that never gets published in a high impact journal. So you're seeing a horrifically curated view of the actual totality of the evidence. We know, looking broadly at all the evidence, how toxic and lethal these vaccines were. But the average person, the average schmo walking around the street, listening to the news, listening to Fauci, is hearing safe and effective all the time. And anyone who claims otherwise is some fringe, quack, radical, whatever. It's tiresome.
Now, can you tell me what you discovered about vitamin D disinformation?
Oh yeah. So I got to tell you, I don't have much time. We have a quick little anecdote, but my book, The War on Ivermectin, was inspired by an email I received one morning in March of 2021 from a guy I didn't know. Is from Professor William B. Grant, and he wrote me an email. This is during the height of the ivermectin war, where the disinformation around ivermectin was crazy. And he wrote me an email. And he said, "Dear Dr. Corey, what they're doing to ivermectin, they've been doing to vitamin D for decades." And he included the link to the disinformation playbook. And that's the first time I read that article. And when I read that article, I suddenly knew what was happening around the topic of ivermectin. And I've since become collegial and friendly with Professor Grant. He's one of the most published researchers on vitamin D. And he has written extensively about all the tricks that we've been talking about today. They've been pulling for decades with vitamin D, purposely giving low doses, purposely treating for short periods, purposely following up for short periods, purposely studying things that vitamin D shouldn't affect, not in that time frame. And then study after study gets published showing that vitamin D doesn't help any disease. But for everyone that they do, there's also plenty of studies showing the critical importance and benefits of vitamin D. And so after decades of studying vitamin D, you know what you have? You have any claim around it as being controversial because all of the data conflicts and it gets neutered. And so you don't know what truth is anymore. We know how important vitamin D is. The COVID data on vitamin D was crazy. If you had a good vitamin D level, if you had it over 50, there was almost no deaths found. And, I've said from the beginning of COVID, a reasonably functioning and moral and just public health agency would have immediately started a vitamin D assessment and replenishment campaign for the entire country at the onset of COVID. You would have had every doctor checking vitamin D levels, supplementing with the correct doses to get their levels higher, and nothing like that happened. In fact, you were told that vitamin D doesn't help. It's criminal.
Right. Well, beyond that, number one, vitamin D is cheap. The supplement is really inexpensive. Right. And so they wouldn't do that. Also, I find that it conflicts with the vegan agenda because vegetarians think, I can get vitamin D from plants and vegetables, which they can't. They get vitamin D2, not D3. In fact, if you subscribe to Robert Malone's newsletter, he recently did research about how vitamin D2 is transient in the body. Vitamin D3 sticks around and you get it from meat. You can't get it from anywhere else other than meat sources unless you take a supplement. And people don't want to talk about that. How they think that the vitamin D that they're getting from plants is sufficient and it's not. What do you think of that?
And that's actually what I would call misinformation or being misinformed. I think it's important where you get your vitamin D from and how much you take. But even outside of when I think of vitamin D, I think of the fact that I think it's 90% of the country is deficient, number one. When you think of the poor and low income, especially in the northern states, right, in the winter, they're literally immunosuppressed all winter. They have sub-physiologic or protective vitamin D levels. There's no consistent supplementation programs or policies. And then the biggest crime now, you probably know this, is that the normal levels of vitamin D that are targeted in the US population are artificially lowered based on studies. The idea that below 30 is what's called deficient, I would call deficient. If I was Dr. Fauci, let's say you put Dr. Corey, the head of HHS, I would make the lower end of normal for vitamin D 50. And they do this, and this is the crime. And I'm like, hey, I'm sick of ringing the same bell over and over again. They do want us sick. If you had everybody with a healthy and robust vitamin D level, the amounts of illness and hospitalization would plummet, particularly with COVID. The billions that remdesivir made in hospitalized patients would have been millions. All of the money for everything. And also the amount of illness and the severity of it would have been much less. I think the appetite for vaccines would have been muted. It goes against their objectives. You don't want a healthy population. You want them reliant on on oversold pharmaceutical interventions that are supposedly going to keep you healthy when there's lots simpler and cheaper and safer ways of keeping you safe and healthy. And like you've talked about, and I don't know how to change it, except for doing things like this, is having these discussions, and hopefully the public is listening.
Yeah. Well, I always love talking to you. You make a ton of sense. So thank you for offering your time on Redacted again. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Natalie. Great talking to you.